So a very, very warm welcome. You're nearly there. The final hurdle is nearly done. So well done for getting this far. You're probably feeling a little bit frayed by now. I know that research is quite a daunting subject. It's not a typical module. If you didn't realize it at the beginning of the semester, I'm quite sure you do now. And, you've actually done most of the hard work already, I hope, because if not, you may have to rework and have quite a bit of work ahead of you, but it's not like there's a lot of new work to do. Right, so the plan for this evening then is that I'm going to spend the first half hour just doing the big picture, where your marks coming from, how is the whole thing getting put together, some basic recommendations, some outline for you, and of course, an overview of what's required for this additional part 4 that's above and beyond what you've done for projects 1, 2, and 3, which are also included here. And then at 6 o'clock, we're going to do the quant. We're going to go from top to bottom through if you're doing a quantitative study. So all the qualitative people can have an hour's break at that point. And then at 7 o'clock, I'll finish with the quantitative people. They can then log off. And if the qualitative people can come back again at that point, and then I'll go from top to bottom through everything that includes what you need to do, what the sort of headings that you needed to do if you're doing a qualitative study. All right, if there's anybody who has ended up doing a critical realist study, you can just let me know and I'll point out where you would have to do things a bit differently. But I do think it stops confusion because, this, if you look at the rubric, it is trying to play to both methodologies, and that can also sometimes cause confusion as to what goes where. So if we take it one by one, then I can just speak in a qualitative voice or a quantitative voice, and that will hopefully help you as well. Okay, so let's get going then. I'm Paula. You can just pop any questions in the chat, put your hand up. I'll return to that whenever possible. So a big, big warm welcome to our final project for submission. Right, so this is the big picture, and it is the entire research proposal. So everything that you did for projects 1, 2, and 3, plus an extra thing, which we're calling the conclusion. That's made up of several parts, but it's effectively a conclusion to your proposal, is actually only going to weight 15%. So the new work only counts 15%. So if you think about it like that, it's actually probably more important that you fix all of the other work if you didn't do so well in it. And, if you think that this new work is just part of that 200 marks, it's not, it's obviously important and it's a chance for you to get some more marks for sure, but not to the exclusion of, or what I've seen some people do, which is just leave out and not even submit parts 1 to 3, but also perhaps just not remember to update them or use the feedback or see where they went wrong. So that the weighting for this is 30% as well. So I really hope for your sake that you did well in project 3, because that was the big one. That was the 40%er. We had our workshop at that point that hopefully would have helped you a bit at that stage. Okay, so this is what your overall project 4 is going to look like. Okay, so you're going to have a title page, then a content page, and what goes underneath it, the actual bulk of the whole proposal, is divided into 4 sections. 1 is the introduction, which was project 1. 2 is the literature review, which was your project 2. 3 was the research methodology, or project 3. And then finally, part 4 is the conclusion that you're going to add on to the end of that. So now it must read as one single cohesive document. If you were to perhaps go ahead and do this research, this is the kind of document that you would have as a basis to go through for a proposal that you would then apply to actually do research with. Okay, then after that, you've got your references, of course, very important to get that right and not lose a hefty 5 or 10% there. And then Appendix A, AI declaration, and Appendix B, your questionnaire. Okay, so that's the recommended order for you. All right, so this is where you've also got to think that, okay, maybe you did very well, your mark-wise anyway, in project 1, you did well, you think, oh, I got like 80% for that. And then you think, oh, I didn't do too badly with the other ones as well. And you think, oh, well, I'm not going to bother about going and changing those. But remember now it is one single document. So it can't just be seen as separate things. And if you were to really do a proposal for honours or so on, it wouldn't have been faked, divided up like we've done into the series of projects to try and help and guide you through it. It would be one cohesive document. So you've almost got to go back and re-look at the whole thing with that in mind. Okay, so you may have done very well in project one, but if it is not actually what you ended up saying in, let's say, what you did in your literature review or taking that through to the way you set up your questionnaire, then your marks that you would have gotten for project one is suddenly going to be brought way down because the question that you had there is not supported by your actual questionnaire. So you do need to look at it with fresh eyes again and just assume that you are being marked where you are being marked. So you are being marked from scratch. So you've got to assume then that it's not necessarily going to be ideal to think you're getting a bit complacent because you think you did quite well on that. Okay, so if you're not sure about that, then let me know. I will try and give you some help there or some guidance on it, but that should give you the big picture. So because it's all of those projects together, now you've got a hefty 4,000 words, and they've given you leeway up to 5,000. So you're aiming for 4,000, not 5,000. Oh, but I'm just going over it a little bit. They have actually been quite generous in allocating an extra 1,000 words for you there. So the moment it hits 5,000, we can't mark it. So that includes from the very first word of the introduction to the very last word of the conclusion. So it's not including your reference list or your annexures. It's including your questionnaire. It's not including your table of contents or your cover page, but it's including everything in between those two, including headings and including in-text references. So that means you simply follow this. Word does it all for you. Just highlight, click before the word introduction, drag all the way through your document to the end of conclusion, and Word will tell you exactly how many words there are, and that you pop onto your cover page. The cover page, maybe your lecturer's also giving you what they would like there, but typically it's a good idea to have your research title in there and obviously all the normal things that you would put on an assignment. And then this word count as well. Okay, so I said if you go back to this here, that here's your content. Okay, so that's what the 4 parts are made up of. So let's just break down those again. It just is a bit of a recap because you should be well aware of this. If you recall, project 1 now becomes part 1. And then what was in that? There were the headings that you had to have. Okay, so as I said, when we go at 6 o'clock into our various methodologies, so I will just be speaking to the quant people first, then I will show you exactly what to do and what to just check for in each of these sections. If you approach it quantitatively, the qualitative people can log off for that hour, and then at 7 o'clock we switch over, and then I'll go over this and show you what you should do for each of those sections and things to watch out for and double check. All right, and then project 2 now becomes part 2 of your proposal. And if you recall, it was made up of those 3 sections. So not too many sections, but of course that was quite long. If you remember the review of previous literature, that was a good couple of pages long at least. Okay, and then you've got project 3, which should be very fresh in your mind because you've just done that. And I imagine you're sort of getting your results back, and hopefully you've seen there what you did right, what you perhaps didn't do so well in, and I'll try my best to help you with any of that you are unsure of. And again, when we do our split into quant or qual, I will go through the methodology that's applicable for each of those, and hopefully that will clear up anything that you're not particularly sure of. Okay, and I put a star there for the addendum, the questionnaire, because of course that is part of the methodology, although it's not positioned in there. So for some of you in your project 3, you may have just put it in as part of the content of your assignment that you uploaded, but now it must officially go after your reference list and after your AI declaration. So that's, I've just said there, don't forget about it, because that's a waste of marks, but it is technically part of your methodology section. All right, so therefore, those 3 sections plus the new work, which you call conclusion, that is made up of those 4 sections there. And I'm just going to speak a little bit more about those now in a little bit more detail. And then when we do our split again, then we'll look at exactly what the quant people need to do with validity and reliability, and exactly what the qualitative people need to do in terms of trustworthiness. So I'm just going to touch on them for now. And then you also need to specify the ethical considerations that you would very importantly have to write about in any proposal. If you wanted to get approval to do research, that would be a key thing that would be looked at by ethics committees and so on. And then any limitations that you can think of that potentially would impact your study. And then, of course, why is the study worth doing, and the anticipated contribution. And that is the section that makes up the conclusion. Okay, so I was saying earlier that you must take their feedback into consideration. Hopefully you've been doing it as you've been going, but maybe not. Not sure if you thought about it. And even if you did make the corrections based on what feedback you got from your lecturer when you originally did the work, did you actually now change things further? Because when it's being marked and when your lecturers are giving you feedback, it's not always clear how this research proposal is going to progress. And it's very natural in any research process to go back and revise and edit things and iterate things. And, when you do your questionnaire, you suddenly realize that, that question was too broad, or I need to go and edit this, or maybe my research problem actually is not going to work anymore, and I've changed my population now, so I must go and put that in the background section. So it is an iterative process, and in fact, that's what the very first chapter of your textbook talks about. Okay, so you've got to include an upgrade. So corrections, yes, but also you've got to upgrade it now, elevate it a bit. All right, and then you add on your last few sections. So this is just to note where the mark allocations come from. So ethics and limitations, if you look at the rubric, they put them together, but they are 2 separate things. So we will talk about them separately. However, they together count 10 marks, 10 out of the 200. All right, so the first section now, just to go through some of what's required there, your validity, reliability, and trustworthiness. So hopefully you're aware of this then, and those are the elements that you're going to be writing about. It's a chance to show that you understand. It's also a chance for your lecturer to see, did you just copy and paste from somewhere? Because it's quite easy to tell when you don't really know what you're talking about when you explain this. So make sure you just keep it simple. It's a very small study. There's limited things that you can do to actually ensure these things, but show that you can explain what these concepts mean, and then which elements you're able to show, and in the quantitative side test for, and in the qualitative side explain how you could apply those things to your research. You've got to be very careful about not sort of over-promising here, because of course a small study, you're not going to be doing things like triangulation or be doing all sorts of fancy validity and reliability tests. But you do want to show which ones you can, and those we will look at in detail when we go to your specific methodology. All right, so there's the next section then. So ethical considerations and limitations. So the first thing is that there are certain ethical implications that apply that are a little bit different depending on whether you're doing a positivistic or interpretivistic study. So who are your stakeholders? And of course, in a qualitative study, that would be your participants. And in a quantitative study, it would be your respondents. But there's also other people that might be impacted as well. And of course, if you were to do perhaps honors and you were going to stay with Emirates for that, then you would think, okay, well, now what am I going to need to do in order to get ethical clearance? So going through the committees that award this kind of thing. And that would be the same for any institution that you needed to get your clearance through. So there's quite a few different stakeholders. And of course, if you were maybe doing research on a company basis, perhaps this is something that maybe you look at doing for work one day, then maybe they would be a stakeholder. So that's just what that part means. And then what would you do to ensure that your participants, your respondents, are being treated well, that they're not feeling like they're too compromised in any way. And I think that's probably a good word to use when we're looking at research in the management sphere, because it's not like you're doing psychological research or something like that where there's real ethical issues that can crop up and that can seriously harm people's. But maybe there is a chance that you could veer that way. You know, there's always sort of managerial issues that I guess could come up from a psychological perspective that you would have to worry about. But ultimately, you're going to need to show that you are thinking about your respondents and your participants, that you're trying to keep them comfortable, that you're not going to compromise anything that they would perhaps be doing in the workplace or having to give information they would feel uncomfortable giving, and you need to show what you would do to limit that as much as possible. All right, and then the limitations. What is it about your research that perhaps allows you to keep it small, keep it manageable, but then that's going to have some sort of consequence? So it could be the time and budget that you've got where you couldn't get enough of a sample size to be able to really gather the data you needed to answer your research question. So it's that kind of thing. And we will look at that in a bit more detail later as well. All right, and then the final new section that you have to do is the anticipated contribution of the study. So this is now, what do you think you will know at the end of the study that you didn't know at the start of the study? And you would have already established right up front in Project 1 what the relevance of your study is, and you should be very, very well aware of what you're going to be able to do now, having just done the research methodology section. So how can you now think there was that gap maybe that you established in the lit review part that you are going to be able to close to some extent? Or what are you going to add to the body of knowledge that we didn't know beforehand, even if it's only a small little thing, like perhaps understanding this issue in the town that you happen to be doing the research in? So it's not like you're being asked to change the world. And in fact, if you over exaggerate here, that's probably even more of an issue. So be careful with that. It must be logical, practical, realistic. But you do want to find some sources that suggested that more research was needed on this, and how you've gone ahead and done it. Maybe you saw it in one of the articles that you read for your literature review, that there really is a need for more research on this area, and you can quote that, because you also need to be able to substantiate this area. So then I'm going to give a little bit of time now, I think, on this section for you to have a look and see if you can come up with one reference sentence that is going to add the weight you need for this anticipated contribution. So I'm just going to finish off what else is required on this overall submission, but then I want you to think about that, and then you can post it in the chat and we can look and see if that makes sense. Okay, because I think that's probably quite a tricky thing to get right. So let's see if you can do a bit of brainstorming there. Okay, so just some notes then on this final submission. Again, you've got to rework all of the other ones. Most of the marks are for that. Use your feedback, make adjustments, but then also note that you won't get exactly the same marks. So don't think, oh, just, in that first one, oh, I got 5 out of 6, or I got 9 out of 10. Because now, as I said, it's now got to hang together and it's got to align. That golden thread has got to be present throughout. So we are expecting you to level up a bit, and then it must be a cohesive whole. And also, you would notice in the rubric, which I'll go through with you as well, that you're now being marked for things like, is the flow there? Are you using your same voice throughout? Have you actually done that spell check or that Microsoft editor check or whatever tool you've got? So even something like Grammarly that helps you with your grammar, remember, it mustn't change your voice, because it's going to be very noticeable if that happens. So only for editing in terms of major grammatical errors, major writing style errors, and of course definitely do your spell check. So if you've got bad punctuation or something, check for that, but don't let it rewrite for you. Because I was chatting to some supervisors yesterday, and we all agreed we would rather have authenticity and have your own voice there than some bland, like AI bot sounding kind of corporate speak like we all so bored of seeing all the time. So yes, you definitely need academic references and anticipated contribution. That's what I'm wanting you to try and find for me now. One sentence that you can reference that shows that more research was needed in this, or there's a gap here or there, and then you can link that to your research and say that, yes, it is now something that you've been able to contribute, or you would be able to contribute. Okay. All right, so that's there. And then when are we looking at? How many weeks you got left? Two plus or minus a meeting for the anticipated contribution? Okay, all right, okay, there we go. Yeah, so exactly 2 weeks. It's not that long, but it does depend on how well you've done up till now. Let's be honest, it is, for some people, a major rework. For other people, not hopefully going to be too bad. And I don't know if you've got other exams in between then. I wouldn't be surprised if you have. But maybe this is towards the end. Yeah, maybe this is the last one you've got, in which case you will be in for a huge celebration after that. And for many of you, I imagine it's perhaps even the very end of your whole varsity career. So that will be amazing. Well done for getting to this point. If you think about it, hey, it's actually quite incredible. The trials and tribulations hopefully will all be worth it. And then you're in for a rest and a celebration, I'm sure. That's something to look forward to. Okay, so yeah, that's not too long. So just work out so you don't rush it, please. You're going to need time for that proofreading, like I said. All right, so that flow. I actually recommend that if you can get somebody else, just have fresh eyes on the whole thing, because I know what's going to happen. You're cutting and pasting and putting it together, and you wrote it back part one when you were fresh at the beginning of the semester, and then maybe when you did the lit review, you used AI to help you write some of the lit review, and now you've got the third section, now you've got the fourth section. It must make sense as one single document. So make it you, make it your own, make it your voice speaking. It should be uniquely yours. We shouldn't be looking at, like I say, the same old bland, boring stuff with the same mistakes, quite honestly, is very evident to see as well. But get someone else to read it and just say, look, does this actually make sense altogether? Can you notice things where was a bit more slapdash or wasn't, or where there's lack of alignment? Does it still make sense to you? Does it sound like it was written in one go? Because that's what you're looking for. You want it to sound like you wrote this all at one time and it wasn't separate projects. Because remember, that's just fake. That is fake, so we got a chance to give you feedback throughout the process. All right, so that golden thread, I don't know if you've heard of that. Have you heard of that concept? It's a very important thing in research. And it's that one thread that should flow from top to bottom. And in fact, I might even say, thank you, I might even say that there are a few that actually apply here, because I want to see that methodology flowing all the way from top to bottom. So the title should say, yes, this is a quantitative study, without explicitly writing the word quantitative, but just I can see, yes, that's a quantitative study. And then the whole way through, the language that's used, the way the research problem is framed, the headings that are used right down to the end when it's the validity and reliability, everything must align to quantitative. Same thing with qualitative. So that is one golden thread we're looking for. Of course, when we mainly talk about the golden thread within research, we are talking about, oh, what are you researching, and does it stay the same? Does it stick there? So it's very clear and focused as to what you're trying to do. So your questionnaire is asking you questions that are going to help you get to your research problem and ultimately to what your title was about in the first place. So it needs to be clear and evident there. And then, of course, I also think it's worthwhile if you've got another friend who's also doing the module or who's willing to help you with your referencing, to get somebody to just check that for you. Because now in a 200-mark document, suddenly those errors can creep in. So you may not have got deductions up till now because they were short projects. And you know, there was, when you look at it like that, there probably weren't the sort of 5 errors or so that have to accumulate before you get a deduction. Now it's very easy to get to that. So don't lose that 5%. It's a lot. Hey? It's in fact, if you think about the overall 200 marks and how much work you've done for 200 marks, 10% is 20 marks of that. Okay, if you're using 10%. So, you know, it's either you do it fresh one day yourself and you only look at it by looking at referencing, or you swap with someone and say, look, let's do each other's or something. Depends on how much eye you've got for detail. Okay, so definitely check that. And then, of course, the AI there, so the ethical use of AI, if you've used it even for one sentence, you've got to put that AI declaration in. Okay, put the AI declaration in, be explicit about what's in it. I will also show you some examples of that. But yeah, just whatever you do, you've got to put the declaration in, and then don't copy and paste from AI. Because like I said, if you just get that banal, boring, same old, repetitive stuff, and we can see that it's been written by AI, not by you. It's very easy to just use your own voice. Okay, so let's have a quick run through of each of these. And like I say, I'm not spending long now because I am going to do it per methodology shortly. But we've got the research title there, so make sure that you've got everything you need for numbers of words. And I want you to give me your research title now. It's the only thing that I'm going to ask for in this session, because just in case somebody is still confused about that. So if you've got to change the whole study, that's very hectic. You're going to need to speak to them about that, I'm afraid, because it depends on so many things. So if you can, try and say how you would resolve them, but the issue there is more on stating what they are. Why do you think that's the most important thing? Yes. Oh, okay. Yes. Okay. So no, then the questionnaire is there, but I will show you. If yours is qualitative, you stick around for the qualitative hour, and I'll show you them. It's just called an interview schedule, but you still use Annexure A questionnaire, but the questions just happen to be an interview schedule as opposed to that. So don't worry about that. Okay. But if you stick around for the qualitative, I'll definitely come back to that. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to come back to this just to make sure everybody knows what their methodology is. So you stick around for the right hour. So actually, if you can please also tell me what your methodology is. So just say quantitative or qualitative. I mean, I can see from that. So Samishka, yours is definitely looks like anyway, is a qualitative study. Marty, yours is quantitative. So you can put those up just to check that. But anyway, so that's your title there. Stick around for that. And then I'm going to go through these in more detail. All right, this is where I wanted to get to. All right, so after your reference list is going to be your use of AI. So you should really know how to do this, but it's not just referencing, because using OpenAI as a source is not a valid source. So you can't actually do that. You can't reference AI in your work. So using it for brainstorming or for helping you do this or that, you must just put it as a declaration. Don't include it as a reference, because everywhere littered all over this rubric is credible references, credible sources, and it's definitely not that. So that is not what we mean by ethical use of AI. This is what we mean. Put a disclosure in, say what tool you used, what you used it for, how much you use it, and then link it to it, put screenshots in, just put as much evidence as you can, and then at least you've covered. So that's especially that you've used it responsibly. Okay, and I think that's critically important. Please do that. Okay, so there we go again. Final tips. Declare AI use, correct referencing, check your word count, make sure that golden thread is there. All right, so yeah, your referencing, we'll talk about that as well, but referencing also, now that you put it together, have you just used the textbook, or methodology particularly? Like we'll try and find some sources for you apart from that, because you want multiple credible sources. In your conceptualization, if you only used one source per contact, now's the time to add another source in. So use credible sources. In your lit review, now is the time to check, are your sources quite recent? So maybe it's time to think about adding some more from the last 5 years. That will level up your literature review if you've got older sources. So that's definitely something to check there. Okay, and then as a last couple of points before we go into the quantitative study is don't forget the rubric. I will go through it now as well and just show you what to expect for each of these, but that is what your lecturers are marking you on. So you've got to check the rubric. Okay, there's no ways that you can do a study like this without saying, okay, how have I done? Have I done anything that's putting me in the fail block? Of course, that's the first thing to check. But then look at the distinction block and say, yep, I feel like I've done that. And that's really important. Okay, and then with your tenses, remember you are not actually doing this research. It is just a proposal. So this is how you would collect your data. This is how you would analyze your data. So that's all future tense. However, the literature review, this is what they found. This is what the other researchers said. So in that case, that can be when they did their research. That can be in your past tense. So watch out for that. Don't make it sound like, oh, the data was collected by doing this, because then you're implying that you've done the research. And remember, this is just a proposal for how you would do it. Okay. All right. And then again, that is going on your main cover. All right. So that's given you a good overview there. So we are doing quantitative first. Obviously, you're welcome to stay around if you're doing qualitative, but so exploring customer experiences of digital banking, that is, so you're doing a qualitative study then, I'm assuming, so you will come back at 7. Analyzing the impact of marketing, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that is going to be a quantitative study, so you can stay now. And you've repeated that's qualitative, perfect. The use of understanding the use of social media, so that sounds like it's qualitative, so you will come back at 7. So there's such a thing as seminal sources. So if you've got some from that time, that's okay, but this is a time to maybe add some newer ones then. Okay, determining how business is affected by. So that the language of that title is a little bit, sounds like it's quantitative, but then when you want to say how it's affected, you should rather just be saying determining if. Okay, so that's a separate issue, but I agree that it's quant, so you can stay on now. All right, anybody not sure whether their research is quantitative or qualitative? So now 6 to 7 is quantitative, 7 to 8 is qualitative. If you are unsure, ask me, because then you're going to be staying for nothing otherwise. You're going to do quantitative only now. So best if you just log off now, or just put yourself on away and off you go and come back at 7. Okay, don't confuse yourself. All right, so quantitative people, for the next hour, we are focusing just on your research, and you can come and ask any questions that you might have related to that. Okay, so yeah, I'm not going to go over all of that. We are starting right here with what you're going to have in project 1. Okay, I don't see anything else on the chat there. So therefore, those are going to be your headings there. So hopefully that you can see you've got hypotheses there, and we're going to go through in more detail now. The lit review is the same for everybody. And then here, your addendum is just going to be the questionnaire. All right, so this new work that you have to do, so I'm starting with the new work, just because that is probably something you may be a little bit unsure of still. So your first thing is going to be validity and reliability. You have to be able to explain those. So when you see in the rubric and so on, they use the word trustworthiness as well, you must ditch that. That does not belong to your research. So just validity and reliability, and then those 3 sections. So let's look at those in more detail. Okay, so you were asking there, are they the same thing? Now you can see that they're not, hey? So 2 separate things that you need to talk about. First of all, we'll pick whichever one, doesn't matter which order you do it in, but you need to go through the one, and I would just have separate paragraphs for them so that you show you switching between them. So validity is all about measuring the right thing. So did we actually research what we intended to research, which is really important if you think about it. And then reliability is, how did it actually go? So if somebody else had to do it, how reliable can we say our results are? So if you think about it, something can be quite reliable, but the validity could be quite bad. And that's not such a good thing, even though it's reliable. So you want both, and that's why you have to say that you're going to use both. All right, so if you want to pop in anything that you may have on this already that you want to check, or your description, you can put it in the chat. But let's just look at some of those terms in a bit more detail now. All right, so I'm going to just start with, I think, with the validity, because I think it's more important. But if you've done it the other way around, that's absolutely no problem. So don't go and change it. I just happen to be talking about that first. Okay, so if you think about it, how can you ensure, or how can you convince the reader that your research is going to be showing that you're collecting the data that you actually wanted to investigate? Okay, I'm actually going to give you a link here that you can use. Put it in the chat. So you can say that, but that's quite generic. So I'm happy for you to use that as an opening statement, or what you're going to start to open with, but you need to add it a bit more than that. Okay, so with validity then, so I would say then, if you're going to say that, look at my research instrument, I spent some time designing it, I have used scales that are measuring my variables, because you know that's the whole point of quantitative research, of course. Then the first thing that you can say for validity is that you are going to ensure face validity. Okay, so this means that the measuring instrument, being your survey or questionnaire, the items that you had in there, which is your questions in the questionnaire, they are logically relevant, they're unambiguous, they're clear, and they, especially if you ask a series of questions to measure one of your variables, that they are actually measuring that as well. So on the face of it, you can say that the validity has been ensured because of the relevance of your instrument. Okay, so you can say that one. And then I think something else that everybody can say for this is that you've got content validity. So there it's again, your items reflect what it is that you're trying to research so that they can then be generalized. And this is what, if you use scales that somebody else has already created for you, then that when you did your research methodology section, then that's something that you can also claim. Right, so if you use that source there, that will give you some information. You can, of course, use your textbook as well. They talk about a lot more types of this, and you can also include things like external validity versus internal validity. You can add some of that theory in if you've got something that from that you'd like to bulk up what you're saying. So just show that you understand it. So you would there explain what the term means, and then you want to say what you could realistically do. So go through them, and if there's other things you can say, oh yes, that sounds like something I'm able to do, then of course you can use it as well. But don't go ahead and just use all of them. And then also for the reliability measures, you're not going to be able to do all of that. It's just not the design of your research. You've just done a survey. Remember that all of the things that they're talking about in that chapter are for people who are doing experiments, and think about the scientists growing plants and measuring this and that. I mean, that's not really the same thing. So from a reliability perspective, you can explain that as well. And then one of the things that I think for many of you who are doing the relationship between two variables, and you're measuring the one variable and you have to measure the other variable, then you would test those by using something like a Cronbach's alpha, which is then how internally consistent or reliable is your scale. So if you had 5 Likert scales, it's very useful for that. And I know that if you've gone ahead and used a scale from another researcher, yes, sure, sorry, no problem, I'll slow down. Where shall I retract to? Let me just finish what I was saying by this, and then I'll go back. Okay, so if you are measuring using, let's say, 4 or 5 questions in your questionnaire that are all intended to measure managerial stress, let's say, then the Cronbach alpha is just going to say whether those 5 things together are reliably going to measure that one construct of managerial stress. So you would say that you will run a test on it, and that's how you would determine that you have achieved that. Okay, so that's a simple test that you can say that you're going to do to ensure reliability. There's a lot of other ones. Yes, of course. So I think that 2 of the ones that you can mention are I'll go back to them quickly, is the face validity and the content validity. Okay, so if you did that link work, go and have a look in there. They also explain it in a bit more detail. And then just in terms of face validity then, so if you think about a lot of the constructs that you are measuring, and when I look in the chat now, let's just pick some of these ones. Purchase intention. There we go. That's a very good example. It's how do you actually measure purchase intention? You can't get into consumers' minds, right? So what you would have done then, I'm hoping anyway, in your questionnaire, is that asked a series of questions that were designed to measure people's purchase intention. And if you were able to, maybe you found a scale, which is just a series of questions that somebody's already done and tested. So that is one way of saying that your view of what purchase intention means, the way that your subjective assessment of that and the relevance of your measuring instrument, and whether the items in your instrument are relevant and reasonable and unambiguous and clear. I think those words sum it up nicely. You can say that you will ensure face validity. Something that you can say you've done now. And then when you look at what your questions were that were trying to measure each of your variables, then content validity, that's your items again. Do they measure, if you had to try and generalize that to purchase intention overall, let's say, then if you had to evaluate that instrument, how would you ensure that it includes all of those things that are essential to try and measure about purchase intention? And this point, you might think, oh yes, I remember writing something about that when I did the conceptualization section in project 2, and I had to operationalize. Do you remember that? You had to operationalize if you're doing a quantitative study when you did your conceptualization. And that is one of the things that is referring to operationalizing something as well. You would have said how you're measuring it, and this is going to be then proven when you say your content validity. If that's really looking at it and you think, oh, I actually am just not sure about that, then just keep it simpler. Just go back a section and look at your Research Matters textbook, and then just explain simply, look at what they said for your external validity there, your internal validity, and just keep it simple down to that. Okay, because maybe you just never got a chance to really think through everything, and you didn't really work through your operationalizing, or maybe when you did your questionnaire, you just kind of picked any 10 questions, then a lot of this probably is going to be a bit more difficult. All right, so that's just, as far as you can get to that will be great. Reliability, validity, simple tests of each. I think my main point here is that you don't go and look at all of those different reliability and validity tests that I talked about in that chapter and claim that you're going to do all of them. Just keep it understated. All right. So I hope that makes sense. Let's have a look at your ethical considerations. So you also watch your language you're using now, because for most of you, I imagine anyway, you didn't ask for people's names when they did in your questionnaire, and you probably would have emailed a link out to a survey, and that was what you would have explained that you would do. Of course, you haven't actually done it, but that's what you would have said. Then you can ensure anonymity. Anonymity is almost one step up from confidentiality. So you can claim anonymity, and that is also a way to protect your respondents. So use the right language. It's not participants, it's respondents, because they're responding to a questionnaire. They're not participating. That's what the word that the qualitative people would use. You can ensure anonymity, but you definitely would have to get informed consent, and consent to use the data. And there's quite a lot in that chapter in your textbook as well that you can explain how you would ensure that you as a researcher behave ethically and how you treat your participants or your respondents ethically as well. So you can use any points from that as well. I've just picked out a few things that you can write about here, because ultimately, you want informed consent, you want to be neutral and biased, and then, of course, they must be able to voluntarily withdraw at any point, and you shouldn't be offering any material incentives because that could be considered unethical as well. 5 marks for that. So be clear, concise, and relate it back to your research as well. Don't just make it purely theoretical. Okay. Sorry, that was what was on that slide. Okay, I don't know if you've got any questions about that. I would say about a paragraph each for validity and reliability. Yeah, just 2 would be fine. Just explain what they are and be realistic about what you think you can achieve. All right, this and that, remember, that was for 10 marks. This is for 5 marks. I'll have a look at the rubric shortly with you. And then the limitations now, even though it's the same section, it does make sense to separate them out with subheadings. But this is the limitations of your research. So for a quantitative study, there is a very common problem with them, as in, if you think about it, who likes to fill out a survey? It's quite one of those things. You sample beautifully and you've got your 350 sample, and off you send your research link to the project, and you think you've sorted this, and all you're waiting for in anticipation is to get these responses back, and then you get like 20 who respond. So a very low response rate, particularly if in your data collection section you have said that you're using it via email. It is often the easiest way to administer, the most efficient, most cost-effective. It has huge benefits, but at the same time, it's got a low response rate. Okay. And if you've got a low response rate, how can you actually say that is representative of the full population? The lower the response rate, the more likely that is going to be called into question, which means the generalizability of your results also get called into question. So that might be a potential limitation. Then we've just talked about that, how you want to try and ensure the reliability, the items in the scale measured what altogether gave you a high enough Cronbach alpha to say that that is actually all measuring the same thing. And then we've also checked your content validity, and did you actually use a good scale to do it? How can you actually measure? How can you be sure that that scale is actually measuring something like purchase intention? So that, and I'm not saying these are all definitely yours, I'm just giving you some ideas to talk about. Other common thing is in a small research section, then how can you really spend years doing it? You can't. Time and budget. You can't. You're doing an email survey because you can't go and fly off and interview people or give them your stand there and give them your questionnaire and watch them fill it out. Yes, you can say that. That makes sense. Absolutely. And then, that you would have got informed consent as well. Okay, so let's have a look at these first sections. So go back to here. So you'll remember not to get confused by the word trustworthiness there. So you've explained it, you've referenced it well. So you've got your research matters, you've got that source, and I'm sure you'll find plenty of others as well to use for your definitions. You've given the correct heading because it's validity and reliability, which is because your research is quantitative. And then you've shown that you've understood why these things are important. So why is it? So show that you understand why validity and reliability are both important things to measure and how you need both of them because they're not the same thing. All right, and then you've also given some special measures. Okay, like we talked about some of the specifics there. But you can see that's only one of the 4 points. 10 marks for that one though. Here's the ethical considerations and limitations. So you're looking for clear explanations of all of the ethical considerations. Don't forget you want to use multiple sources wherever possible. If you want to get in the distinction bracket, that's what you're looking for. And then you've also given some of your limitations. It says they're realistically addressed. So what can you do? Well, maybe in terms of that low response rate, you will send out reminders. Maybe if you had a choice and you could do them an in-person one for some, if it happened to work out that way, that it makes sense for what you're researching, then I think you could do something like that. Maybe if your limitation is time, then you can say that you've addressed that by using email surveys, things like that. And in multiple sources. So you're going to need to have a reference maybe that says this is a realistic way of addressing it. Okay. All right, and then there's your anticipated contribution. I don't know if you managed to think of that. You want, you can post what you've done there, but you ideally go back and look and see what you wrote under relevance, under project 1, see if that still makes sense to you, see if you can link it back now. Go back and look at the end of your lit review, because that's when you should have said the gap that you have and that you've found in the literature. Have you been able to fill that? That's something that you can do. You need to substantiate what your claims are that you make, and they need to be realistic and need to be actually really small. You can't overclaim here. Okay, you're not changing the world. It's a tiny little study. That's quite fine. You're doing it in a specific area, in a very small niche little group, a very small topic. So within the context of that, how can you do things? So I think if you just keep it realistic and don't overhype it, is really actually just being authentic, as it would be great. But you can't make any claims without giving a source for it. So, and when I say a source, it would have been from one of your articles that you could have or did use in your literature review. Would be a good place to start for that. So you don't use your textbook or theory here. It's got nothing to do with that. Okay, when they say substantiate, you're making a claim that this is a contribution you're going to make. That's what we mean by you must be able to reference that. Okay, so that's that section. So let's go back to part 1 now. So go back and look at your project 1 and just double check that it says there between 5 and 15. I've never seen a suitable one for 5, but you're aiming for 15, not too long. So when you're looking at that, you should be able to look at your title and say, tick, it says exactly what I'm researching. It's got a verb in there that says that it is quantitative. That's why I was able to look at your titles and know that was what you were doing, because you're not trying to explore. And that's why I query the use of the word how, because a quantitative study can't really say how something's happening. It can just say if something is happening. Okay, so just careful of that. And then you don't need unnecessary words. Like you don't need to write in there that it's a cross-sectional quantitative survey. If your lecturers ask for that, then it's fine. Then obviously listen to them as well. But you don't need it. And you also don't need to add any extra fluff or any extra technical words, acronyms, things like that. In other words, you want somebody who doesn't actually know the topic to be able to know what you're trying to research. And it must be very specific who you're researching and where is it taking place. That's where you're narrowing it down. If you've got that focus, then the rest of your golden thread will come right naturally from that. Okay, so it's a study of, and if I look back at what you put for your research there, it's going back up to it. Okay, so who is it? It's millennials in the restaurant industry in Durban. So there you go. That's a perfect example of it. SMME owners in GRDM. Gen Z. Okay, so that's the kind of thing you do there. All right, so that's, I think it sounds like you know what you're doing there. For your background, just double check now, because you may have since you've done your sampling in your population, this better be in your background now. So update your background with who it is that you're researching. Maybe you realized when you were doing that your target was too broad and you need to now narrow it down. So explain that now. Who is it that you are researching? So why are you researching the millennials? Why are you researching in Durban? That kind of information, you should give some background as to that context here. So if SMEs source of employment in Durban. This is why it's important to understand that. So, whatever the case happens to be, you want to give context as if the reader doesn't actually know that context, because they most likely don't. They don't understand that industry or that group or that city or town or the issues that happen there. So give the background here so that when the person reads the research problem next, they know exactly what you're talking about. Okay, so do that, and then of course you could maybe add some stats or put some claims in here, and that needs to be referenced as well. Lead you up into your research problem, and I want to do that looking, go right back up again at your research problem specifically. Okay, and the reason being, look at that. Look at everything that's required for your research problem. So just double check there. First thing is that it should be concise. So it's hard to be concise, actually, but you want to get to the nitty-gritty. There should not be background information in here. It should just be, this is the general issue that we see, or the general problem. Here's specifically what the problem is. So you want a problem statement in here. Okay, so this is the problem. The problem is, you can literally start the sentence like that. And then, well, we need to be able to find a resolution for this because, so why it needs to be solved. Okay, and then when you look at the way you've just explained all that now, you have to take these criteria into consideration. So is it not too broad in scope and too ambitious? Does it actually add some sort of value? So whether it's some theoretical value or something like that. Is it actually feasible to do this research project? Is it researchable? That's what we mean by those ones. Okay, you've got to have credible sources, multiple credible sources. And again, those are not theory sources. Those are sources from the field that you are trying to research. So there's your problem statement. The problem is, and then the purpose of this research is to. That's your purpose statement. Those have got to be in there. And then the whole way that you write it must indicate that this is a quantitative study. So read over your research problem. You should not be saying how, or I want to get an understanding of this, or how millennials feel about that. No, you cannot do that. All you can do is understand, or not, there's me using the wrong word, not understand. All you can do is determine if there's a relationship between that and this, or whatever the issue is that you happen to be researching. So the language, you must keep the positivistic lens on this whole thing. Okay, you're just trying to determine something. You're going to be measuring it, remember. Okay, so when we read this, alludes to means that it's not explicit, so you don't go and say this data is going to be collected via a questionnaire and it's going to be a quantitative methodology. That's not what we mean here. So you're not going to go and write that information here. That's on project 3. It's just that the way you've written it tells us, oh, I can see this is positivistic. I can see it's a quantitative study. And when I go to the research question, I can see already from here where the question is going to pop up from, because it's going to answer your problem statement. And in fact, your purpose statement effectively becomes your question. Okay, so that's a lot for you to check for that section. Please check that. That is something that almost guarantee you needs to be reworked at this point. Okay, so that takes us then naturally into the relevance of the study. So why should we do the study? It should have been set up already in the research problem. So now you're going to say this is the gap you're going to fill, and having done that contribution, you should also know now which parts are actually relevant. Can you update this? You probably can. Having done your literature review and expose that research gap, you can probably add some relevance in here. Who's practically going to use your results? So the industry that you've chosen, maybe you've amended that in some way, the population, those people can use your research. So this is the kind of thing you want to bring out here. And of course, it must be linked to your specialization or your field. It must be management related, if nothing else. Okay, so yeah, I think there's just some of the points there that we support across there. You can see that cited sources need to be there to show the academic relevance. So when you say add into that body of knowledge, you're probably going to reuse something very similar in anticipated contribution. You can maybe even use the same source there. It's got to be applied here as well. In other words, you can't just make claims. They've got to be backed up. So research is needed into this because, and then you reference that. Whoever said that more research was needed into that aspect. Okay. All right, then it comes to your research question. So your purpose statement within your research problem just becomes a question. It is a quantitative study, so it should start with is or what. Most likely, 9 times out of 10, that's going to be right. So if you've updated or edited your title or anything else that relies on the question, and of course, this is going to filter through to everything else now, is or what makes sense. And you just need one question. From that is going to flow hypothesis. So that's your next heading. So don't look at the rubric because you do not have that here. For some of you, it depends on what your lecturer said. Perhaps they've said to you, no, you're going to do a descriptive study and you don't need hypothesis. Then, of course, listen to that as well. But for many of you, if you've followed the Research Matters textbook, then it will basically say there that positivistic research is looking at a relationship between two variables. And as soon as you want to do that, then you're going to have hypothesis. It's going to be an explanatory study. So you will have an alternate hypothesis and a null hypothesis. And you simply take your question and convert it into an educated guess. So if your question was, is there a relationship between this and that? Then here you can just say, there is a relationship. And the null hypothesis, there is no relationship. You do not need to explain it. You do not reference these. You do not add any gumph around it. It's just simply straightforward and to the point. These are hypotheses, and it should flow straight from your question. And when you question, you look and you see, oh yeah, that question relates back to what the purpose statement was within the research problem. That ties back to my title. There's my golden thread working beautifully. We can see that when we look at the rubric as well. Okay, so there's your research question. It's linked straight to the problem and title. It's phrased as a question, of course. It must have a question mark in it. And if your title and your problem's fine, then of course the rest of that's all going to flow perfectly as well. So we don't worry about that. Your heading, the correct heading, yours is hypothesis. So that's most likely the correct one for the majority of you. It's aligned with the question. And it's been formulated properly. So what does that mean? It means it's that HA equals and the H0 equals. Okay, concise and feasible and ethical, that will all come through anyway. So that is part 1 done, introduction. Now we come to part 2, literature review. So if you are copying and pasting into one document because you did them all separately before, don't forget to carry through the references that you've used. And you must amalgamate them now. So there's one single final reference list at the end. After all, it is one document. And I don't think there's too much extra that you need to worry about here that would have changed because your theoretical approach is your theoretical approach. You only need one suitable theory, and things just to double check here are that you've got multiple sources, that you've explained and applied it. I don't think that's too tricky because if you look here, it's exactly the same as you would have gotten for your second project. So just go in there, I would say just go and look at the feedback that you got there at that time. And it's probably quite close at this point. Okay, so that shouldn't be too much of a problem unless you messed up at that stage. Okay, so you're more than welcome to ask any questions about that. I think the most important thing that you're looking for, though, is that you have actually identified a theory. It is an actual theory, not just more literature review. Okay, so it's not just some more background information or something. It's an actual theory that's in textbooks that people study. It's got to be a well-founded and well-named theory. Right, so what can you do now for the next section? So these, I think, are the most important points to note. So you have a look at your feedback at this point. What did you do in your lit review section? So in project 2, after the theory, you had your review of previous research. So at the least at the very end, you should have said, well, this is what all the current state of the research is into my topic. And here is what my research is going to add. There's this gap in the research. So lots of other people have researched this concept, the link between whatever the two variables are, but nobody's actually done it in the context of Durban or millennials or something like that. So that is how you bring it through at the end. Again, don't overclaim it, don't overstate it. It's very easy to see when AI is trying to do this for you because it completely overhypes everything. Just keep it simple. The other thing, the big error that comes through in this is where you just summarize the 5 articles and then there's no integration, no synthesis, because it is meant to be a critical evaluation of what the other people have found and how they did their research, what they found, what they said, who agreed with whom, and which studies did the same sort of thing and came up with the same findings and all of that kind of thing. So those are the 3 main criteria you're looking for. And in a little bit more detail to think about now that you can see that you might need to update is, are you missing any sections? Because what might have happened at that point is that you just said, okay, there's 5, I've got my 5, I'm done. And now you've done your questionnaire and you think, oh, I didn't have anything about this in my lit review. So I better go back and just add another paragraph in there, add a couple of sources and check that it's complete, because you might be missing a whole thing. Maybe when you originally did this and one of your variables, let's say you were looking at the consumer perception, you weren't quite thinking of the same thing, and now you realize that, okay, well, I actually should be looking at this from a South African perspective. So what did other people find from a South African perspective? And you can go and do that. All right, and then big mistake, of course, is if you happen to include any sources in there at the time who were not actually from journal articles, published research, and preferably ones that have been peer-reviewed, so they should be in a legit journal that has been cited by other people. That would be great, checked by other people. And then you perhaps also want to restructure some of it. So check the overall flow. Are you telling a good story here? Or is it all very disjointed? So check that. And then again, that word synthesis or integration. You are looking to combine sources. So you should never see a whole paragraph with just one source in it. So just have a look at that and eyeball it and see what you think. Okay, some more points there is now also double check that you haven't gone for long sections with no sources. In other words, you just doing your own opinion there, or you're re-explaining something. That's not the point of a literature review. The point is to assess what other people have found, show what other people have found, compare what other people have found. So if you've done that, then there's something wrong and you need to go and substantiate things you've made. Either you forgot to reference it, or it's not a literature review, or perhaps what you put in there is just an analysis of what that topic, what that word was, and as opposed to what the other people who researched the concept found out about it. So double check that. You can also eyeball and see if you've got maybe big sections of a paragraph with no sources in it. So when you look at a single paragraph, multiple sources, multiple different sources, and no long sections with no sources. Right, integrate and synthesize again to remember that in your own words. Check it out, and if possible, put some subheadings in there because that structures it. It's a long section. So if you think about how nice it is to read 2 pages when you're giving the reader signposts by putting headings on paragraphs or a couple of paragraphs. And especially for your research, when those of you that are looking at the relationship between 2 variables, it would be nice to see those in there as well with headings. Okay, let me just, before we carry on, just go back and show you this. So it's out of 20 marks, it's 10% of your final paper. And there you can see that's where the relatively recent comes in. So maybe you want to go and add some sources in the last 5 years, if you didn't have that already. And some very credible sources. You've given some thought to it, and then you positioned the gap that I mentioned. Quite nice to actually even go ahead and put a little heading in there at the end that says a research gap established or something, and then write it like that, make sure it's clear. There's that synthesis again. There's lots of things in the no column. So please check that you're not missing anything here, because if you do one of these things wrong, like for example, if there's less than 5, you're automatically in the fail category here. If you don't have a research gap, the gap that your research is going to fill, it's automatically in the fail category. If you've only summarized and not integrated enough, off it goes into this category. Okay, so please check that. All right, and then we've got the last section of part 2, and that is going to be the conceptualization. This almost guaranteed is going to need to be updated because of your questionnaire. So those concepts, look at any abstract concepts that you've got in that questionnaire and think about, should you not be explaining it here? Okay, because you had to operationalize it. It was difficult to do at this point, but now you've actually done it because you've done your questionnaire. So come back and explain it here. Authoritative sources are more than credible. They are generally also from peer-reviewed articles, so definitely look at that. And then I think 2 sentences is enough. Again, you'd have to listen to your lecturer and see if they ask for more than that, but you shouldn't be writing long stories here about it. That should be in the literature review. You know, you probably find that you have mentioned these concepts in your literature review already when you compared how different authors or different researchers explained them. But here's what you mean by it. So this is your definition. Here's the source for it, and here's how it relates to your research. And maybe you have another source to add it up. So like 2 to 3 sentences, you shouldn't be going on too long. Yeah, you want to get to the point, and then you want to say, this, how will something like purchase intention actually be operationalized now? Well, you are measuring it through so-and-so scale that is asking a series of questions related to the way that people, I don't know, mention the way that they intend to buy something. So you can show here that this is going to link to your questionnaire. Okay, I am going quite fast, I know, just because of time, but you're welcome to stop at any time if you've got a question on this. Okay. All right, so that's the end of part 2. Have you got your marks back for your 3rd project yet? I'm not sure. It was quite difficult to find a balance now to give you enough time to work on this. And then, yeah, okay, good. Okay, so all right. So a bit of a mix and match there. All right, so that means that you've got that fresh to work with, which is great. So I don't think I really need to add too much here. You must listen to what your lecturer asked of you here. But of course, your paradigm, the first section under here, you're going to say that's positivism. You should have explained what positivism is and referenced that. You should have linked it to your research, so not too much theory without showing, okay, what is it that you're trying to research? So it's quite tempting, because this section is again grouped together with design, to only apply it at the design or methodology stage, but you should be applying it here. Why are you looking at this through a positivistic lens? Like, what does that actually mean? And then, of course, it aligns to what you've done throughout. And just to take that a bit further. So what are you trying to do with positive? So the objectivity of it, you're trying to measure something, explain something, but not understand, not describe something that is how a phenomenon works, or trying to get an understanding of people. You're trying to quantify your answers. So although it's not explicitly stated, you can think of it as being worth 5 marks, and then you need to have gone, obviously it's positivism, but then a balance between the explanation with references and then the justification, which is just linking it to your research. And then the other half, the other 5 marks then will be for the research design. So linking or flowing from that paradigm, of course, your methodology is going to be quantitative. Imagine that majority you've done have said that it's cross-sectional. It's a questionnaire. You've only got 1 questionnaire. You only administer it once. It makes sense. It's a much easier way of doing it. So when you come to your data collection section, you've got a simple procedure of how you'd go about collecting that data once off. That's cross-sectional. It's also deductive. You started with a theory, you flowed down from the general to the specific. And then you may also identify a research type. So it's probably explanatory if you've got hypotheses, but it could also be descriptive as well. Okay, so you want to just show that of course should all link through. So it should all just flow properly, and hopefully that was not an issue, but check your feedback there. Okay, so ultimately that second 5 marks, you need to very concisely get to the point of explaining those 4 things with the emphasis on quantitative. Like, explain what quantitative means. It's quantitative because you're a positivist and because you're trying to, and then whatever your research is about. So use the language that you're trying to determine if there's a relationship between, or quantify that, and that will help with your application section there. Because we have a look here, that is definitely required. So you've identified it correctly. Well, we know it's positivism, but you've explained what that is. Okay, so if you're going to do the philosophical underpinnings here, then that you can also very briefly just mention epistemology, ontology, axiology, or at least the first 2 of those. You know, so that you are objective, that you are trying to look at truth through determining from an objective standpoint if knowledge is what it is. It's not subject to nuances or interpreting human behavior. So there you can see the third point is justifying it by linking it back to your research problem. So that's why I'm saying you must apply the problem. So talk about what your research is about. You're trying to determine the relationship between, and what your 2 variables are. Bring your title in again. Bring your research problem in again. And then those are all the elements. I've mentioned what those 4 elements are, at least definitely the quantitative, and then you can briefly mention the others. Okay, and then of course that just means that the alignment is that it's positive and quantitative, and then you need to have multiple sources within that. Multiple credible sources. All right, so how did you go with your population? And now the only thing that you might have trouble with is seeing your target population as against your what you said in your background and your title. So who are you researching? That should be your target population. You may have originally said South Africa, but now in your target population, you're looking at Durban. So something needs to change so it's all aligned. So that definitely needs to be there. An accessible population is not, you can't just say and repeat the target population and say, but those who I have access to, or those who are willing to answer my research questions. That's not what we mean by accessible. We mean that those who are in the small area that you happen to be capturing the research from. So it needs to be just those that, yes, it's the practical ones that you research, but you need to identify what it is about them or how it is that you're able to access them. Not just that they are willing to answer complete your survey. Your unit of analysis, probably what hopefully was just company or individuals, and then your characteristics. So a couple of characteristics about them that hones it down even more. Double check that when you did your questionnaire that this also makes sense. It should hopefully all align very well. And your parameters, now you've really specified it, should you maybe put some of that back in your background? Does it make sense to maybe add a bit of depth there? Maybe some of that even makes sense to put in your research problem. You never know. It's just something that might make it a bit more cohesive. Okay, that's absolutely not necessary. It's just something we can think about. Okay, so there they are, the target and accessible. Make sure that they're aligned. I think that's hopefully makes sense. Okay, so for sampling, how did you do with your sampling? This can be quite a tricky section. You should have mentioned, based on the rubric, that your overall category is probability sampling. So did you do that? You would have defined what probability sampling is. You would have linked that. You would have justified why is it probability sampling? Because your research is quantitative. And then you would have, because your research is quantitative, you should have a sampling frame, because you can only sample from a list. You cannot just go and pick and choose who you want to sample. So that means you need to have some objective list somewhere, which is effectively a sampling frame. And that should just be one. It's a small little study. You are only researching one population. So therefore, one sampling frame. So list from somewhere. And then with that sampling frame, how would you go about actually conducting the sampling process itself? And then you have to come to your sample size as well. So let's just look at that in a bit more detail. Okay, so probability sampling then, everybody's got a chance of being researched. That's the whole point, because you have to be objective. It has to be, as a positivist, has to be numerical. There can be no bias coming in here. Everybody's has to have an equal chance. So the two recommended ones probably would be random sampling. There's absolutely no reason why not to just go with random sampling. Also, but you can do systematic. Stratified has got to have an exceptionally strong reason to do that, and not just because AI told you to do it, because that means that you have strata. You wouldn't suddenly bring up strata here for the first time. If you were slicing a cake and you were thinking about how you're going to break it up first, why would this be the first time you mentioned it? So there would be something beforehand that already said, okay, you've got these certain categories that you have to be aware of. So a lot of times when stratified comes up, or even people who want to go and do multiple levels of sampling is unnecessary. It means that there's something else wrong with your design. It's too big. Just keep it simple. Okay, so there we go. One of them from chapter 11, choose one of them. You need to define it, of course, reference it, of course, and then say why it makes sense, and then who your sampling frame is. And then you should be using, because in your population, you should have seen what the overall population is. There's X number of SMMEs and this place. I know sometimes that can be difficult, but just estimate what the overall population is. Plug it into an online sample size calculator, and then it spits out an exact number, and that should be in here. You cannot just say, I'm going to research 400 people and thumbsuck it. It needs to be statistically determined. That's the whole point. Otherwise, you've messed up somewhere. It's not going to be valid as a proper quantitative study. Okay, so something like RASOP, there's many of these. Just Google it, sample size calculator. But hopefully you got feedback on that, and that's something that you can double check, because that's quite a lot of marks. We go back and look here. So the population is only out of 10. It's just got those 4 things that I mentioned. Credible sources, of course. But the sampling is out of 15 still. So it's a lot of marks, and if you nail it, you can do quite well in it. Okay, so definitely show the procedure. So if you have to give this to someone else, I'd say, okay, yeah, I can go and do your sampling for you. Okay, and then, oh, still some more I wanted to say. Yes, so this is what I meant by giving it to somebody else. So how would the sampling occur? What would you actually do? You'd get that sampling frame, and then you would use a random sample generator, and having this is the calculated sample size. You would draw that number of people off of your sampling frame or off of your list, and then you would go through it like that and specify what it would be. All right, then you come to your data collection, which is equal weighting to what your literature review was. And think how much work you had to put into your literature review. And you may have been feeling tired when you did project 3. So I don't know, this is something that you may or may not have to add a bit more weight to, add a bit more volume to, maybe even had a word count issue, but at this point you need to take those words away from somewhere else, because you should be outlining all the detail here to get you that 20 marks. All right, so you are definitely using a survey and a questionnaire. That you don't have any other choice here. And you would go about explaining exactly how you would go about doing that. You would justify with reference sources, reasons for choosing certain methods within that, and then of course say why it makes sense for who you are trying to research. So keep bringing in what your topic is about. So there's your motivation. Your motivation must also link back to the fact that, well, it's a quantitative study, so you need to use a quantitative data collection method, and then use the practicalities as well. So somebody could take it and go and do your collection for you. All right, so there's just a bit more detail. So some substance as to why you've chosen this. Okay, because you're trying to generalize or draw inferences to the overall population, and this is a method that you can do that. Okay, a quantitative survey, as a questionnaire, is going to give you certain advantages, and you can then talk about what those are that relate to your research. And then economy of design, very quick to be able to collect the data. And you can use your textbook and other sources as well to be able to justify those reasons. And you can also be very specific. Is it by email, by phone, by the internet? What sort of form are you going to use and why? What is a good reason for doing that? You should also mention that you'd have a pilot test just to double check it. And that also goes towards your validity because you're checking that it is measuring what it's intending to measure. You check that your questions are understood by participants. And there's some of the advantages and disadvantages that you can mention that could feed through to your limitations as well. Okay. So in other words, this is a justification for why you're doing it. And then just understanding it, those could be potential issues, and then that can feed through to your disadvantages. There's some of your different choices as well. So I don't know which one you chose, but you should only choose one, not multiple methods. Okay, online one, probably most of you would have said that. And then you should link at this point and say, well, Annexure, I've said to Annexure B, but if you've got an AI declaration, this may well be Annexure B or Appendix B. So at this point, you also mention that you have created these scales that are measuring your two variables and talk about what the variables are again and how you're going to measure them. And you can say that in the questionnaire, you've asked a series of Likert scale questions that are designed to measure this variable, and another series that are designed to measure that variable, and how there's also a section intended to gather demographic data. So without repeating the questions, you can still talk to them and explain it. You don't have to add the disadvantages. I think you can maybe just use those for what comes in your limitations, or you could say that although this has this limitation, it's not going to be a problem. You would have to justify why that's, or acknowledge that it's an issue, but that it's not something that overcomes what all the different advantages are. So it's up to you. Look and see how much substance you're able to do with everything else. Okay, so then it comes to the actual questionnaire itself, and you should have had an intro and opening section where you introduced yourself and your research, so don't forget about that. You need a little section on that and how they've got, they can voluntarily withdraw and they're giving you informed consent, ensuring the anonymity, and you thank them, and you should say how long it's going to take. So a short paragraph that explains all of that, and then the actual questions themselves. So some of the things to look for here is that every single one should be closed-ended, which means you give choices for people to tick options from. Okay, so what region do you live in? And then you say the different provinces. And if you're not sure if you've thought of all of them, put another option in. Okay, so those, every single one must be able to be ticked. You also don't want to go too far. So 10 maximum that are related to your research, and then 5 additional ones related to the demographics that gets at background or even speaks to the population parameters. Okay, so you want to be able to statistically analyze your data at the end based on some of these demographics, so you can add some more rich analysis. But ultimately, you've got to have the questions that are measuring your variables, that you are measuring what you said you were going to measure. So if you're doing hypothesis-based research, then you need to have variables that measure the one, variables that measure that, questions that measure the one variable, and then questions that measure the other variable. Typically, if it's an abstract concept like that purchase intention, again, you have a series of Likert scale questions. A Likert scale question is a statement, so agree to what extent do you agree with the following statements, and then you might say something like, when I see that item on an online website, then I immediately want to buy it. Let's say that was one of the questions. Then the person would tick from the box from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And then based on that, you can statistically analyze what the data is. So a good scale is actually made up of a number of Likert items. That is one. You would probably ask 4 questions that measure or are trying to pull out from the person whether they really intend to buy something or not. Okay, so that's probably what many of you would have used. Some of you might actually be testing something like profitability, then you be very specific, and if you want to ask them for the exact number to type in, but then be specific, which financial year, for how long, what does it relate to, exactly what type of profit it is, or maybe you're asking a series of questions that look at all different profit figures, then that's fine to put a line for them to type it in, but you need to be very specific in your instructions for what they need to type in there, because otherwise it just makes it difficult for you to do the calculations with afterwards. All right, so on the face of it, now in your final submission, the point comes down to, I can go back and look at your objectives, so your hypotheses, your question, and now say, well, do I really think this question is actually going to do that now? So in this last submission, that really wasn't the test. It was just how well have you designed this. Now we have to say, okay, now how well have they actually asked questions that I think that hypothesis can realistically be tested with? So you need to double check that that aligns. And then of course the textbook will talk about all of those errors, so double check that. You don't want to have any leading questions and so on. That's something that hopefully you would have got feedback on if there were any issues there. All right, so then the last thing to talk about now is your data analysis. And of course yours is quantitative. Remember, you're not actually doing it, so how would you go about analyzing the data? And of course it is going to be statistically. That is what your method is going to be. You need to relate it back to the fact that that's because your study is quantitative, and reference that and say what types of stats you're going to use, particularly the types of descriptive statistics you're going to do. For those of you that have hypotheses, how are you going to test that hypothesis? It could be also via one of the correlation statistics, so maybe Pearson's correlation or Spearman's correlation, and from that, how that would then lead you to be able to see if there is a relationship between those two variables. So apply it again to your research, and then you can also mention how you would present this data analysis as well. Be very careful not to overstate it. You're not going to be using fancy stuff to do very simple study like yours should be. So Excel would be more than sufficient to be able to do this. You shouldn't be talking about having to use SPSS. Have you got any idea how expensive SPSS is? Okay, go 2 slides up to this one. Let me know if that's the one you're talking about. Okay, so watch that, because to me, that's because you've used AI or used Google or something that's told you to use all this fancy software. Or even worse, when you say, I'm going to analyze the data using a tool such as Excel or SPSS. You're not meant to be saying such as, you need to be being specific here. This is your plan. You should be able to give this analysis plan to someone and they can say, oh yes, this is exactly what I'm going to go and do now. So don't be wishy-washy about it. It's got to be, this is exactly what I'm going to do using this exact tool. Okay. All right, so yeah, these are some of the things there. And at a push, you can do some regression. But then you need to say why and what's it going to do for you. Okay, and at the end of the day, this will enable you and bring your hypothesis in again. And that'll be able to say whether your null hypothesis has been proved or not. And then I'm back to where we started. So, or where we started the evening on. All right, so for all of the quantitative people, I'm going to zip you all the way down here to say thank you and good luck. It was quite a fast run through, so I hope that this has helped you, and maybe you'll need to come back and revisit the recording, but at least as a sort of checklist to see what you've done, and as a sort of going for external moderation, which this should do, there is some leeway within what particular lecturers have asked you to do. After all, they are the ones marking, but overall you can say that this does follow what the rubric does, so please you do that as well. All right, all the very best, and then put that date down and have an awesome holiday after that. Celebrate hard, you will so deserve it. Wishing you all the very best. Okay, so if you're doing quantitative, you can log off, and I will start again with the qualitative people. Right, so moving on, we will start at the beginning. So I have already, when we went over this at 5:30, done the big picture stuff. So I'm not doing the big picture here. We're doing the deep dive just into what a qualitative study would involve. Okay, so that means that when we start right here, we've got the same overall picture as the quantitative people, but the very first difference comes in where your part one, which is effectively your project one, it's now part one of your research proposal, has its first difference, and that is in the last heading of part one, which your heading should be objectives. But let's talk through what's here. You will take whatever you did in project one, you will take that feedback into account, but now you need to also check that everything works together. Okay, you'll need to maybe make a few adjustments to project two. And project three, hopefully you've got your feedback. If not now, it'll be quite soon. And then that should be fresh in your mind. And hopefully I will give you some ideas of things. You still need to double check though, however, because it's still got to all link together. And then of course, the new work that I mentioned at the beginning of this evening. And here you can see another difference. And that is that your first heading for the final section is going to be trustworthiness. You are not going to use the word validity or reliability, only trustworthiness. Okay, so let's have a look at that first. And I thought we will start with the part four, now the new work, because for some of you might find that you thought you did really well in the first couple of sections. But I hope that you did take note then that at least it's not necessarily meaning that you're going to get the same mark now. You do need to update it, and I will show you exactly how to do that next. But let's first of all make sure that you've understood this section. Okay, so the first thing is obviously it is the heading trustworthiness. The second thing is that it's got to be specifically those four elements. Okay, so those four dimensions of trustworthiness: credibility, transferability, dependability, and confirmability. I would have a short paragraph for each of those, explain what each term means, and then give application as far as you can to your research. So I'm not sure if you know exactly how to do that, or if you're aware of what those mean, but I'm going to actually copy and paste a source in that you can use, because you would have noticed in the rubric that to do well in each section, you need multiple credible sources. So you can definitely use the textbook, but you want to use more than that as well. Okay, so let me just take this across for you. It's a nice recent source that you can add as well. Okay, so you can reference from that, Ahmed. All right, so they explain very nicely what each of the terms mean. And I think here it's important that you don't just write it superficially or let AI try and help you to understand it, because it's going to overdo it. There's not too much that you're going to be able to do in a small little research study like you are doing to ensure that all of these are like 100% done. Like, for example, you're not really going to be able to try and triangulate. Are you really going to be able to do things like member checks? A lot of it is just not realistic. And this is where we want to see your own understanding coming through. So explain in your own words, reference each of them, and then say how you would try and apply each of them. So I think that source is quite a nice one for you to use to look and see realistically whether you could, how much, to what extent you could do it. For example, you can't really have extended involvement to be able to ensure credibility, because you're doing a cross-sectional study, just one interview with each person. That's not really going to enable extended involvement. You're also not doing an observational study, so you can't do persistent observation. And triangulation, you can only really do that in this limited sense back to the literature. But what they really mean by that would be having a third source, third method, which you're not going to be able to do. So keep it toned down is my advice for this, but also show that you can explain each of them, and also don't be shy of trying to apply it, because that's almost just as bad. In other words, you can't just make this purely theoretical. Okay, so you must say, here's what this term means, and here's how I'm going to do it. Like transferability, you're going to give detailed explanations. So yes, you can say that. Dependability, you're going to have rigorous documentation. You're going to make sure that your transcripts are saved and all of those things that you said in your data collection. So maybe you're going to keep a trail of all that. You're going to keep all the edits of it. You're going to keep them obviously in a confidential way, password protected way. Keep the original interview recordings and document exactly how you would go about your coding and make it so that it is dependable in that way. And through a similar process, ensure that it's confirmable. Maybe you would say that you do some sort of journaling on that aspect. Maybe even possibly some peer debriefing, maybe member checking, which just means you'd go back to the participant and you'd say, this is how I took your transcript and this is how I interpreted it and so on, and then are you happy with the way I interpreted it? And that's all that would mean. And that's something that you could suggest that you would do. All right, so you're happy with that one? You think you can get that part right? Because it's 10 marks for your in this section. It's something that you can score quite well on, I think. That's what's required. All right, I hope so. The next section is ethical consideration. So now you need to watch your language as well. I don't mean swearing or anything. I just mean that use the correct language because you cannot ensure anonymity. So don't use the word anonymity here because you're recording them, you've got transcripts, and yes, of course, you're protecting their identity and you're not going to use their names and so on. But that just means that you are able to ensure confidentiality. Confidentiality and anonymity are not the same thing. So don't say I'm going to ensure anonymity and confidentiality. I see students do that as well because you're not going to do both, just confidentiality. Explain that. Something that you're considering though as an ethical practice. You're definitely going to get informed consent before you go ahead and do your data collection, and hopefully you actually mentioned that in your data collection section. And then of course you are doing interviews, so therefore you have participants. So that's the word you should be using, your participants. You shouldn't be saying something like a respondent. That's for the quantitative people. So then what are you actually going to do to ensure that those participants are treated well? So it doesn't mention a lot in your rubric here, but there's a lot in your textbook about this, about how you can ensure that no harm comes to them, that they feel comfortable, that they can withdraw their consent at any time, and that the way that you treat the data is going to be ethically practiced. You're going to ensure that you are as objective as possible. So there's a number of criteria that you can use to show how you're going to have this clear and transparent relationship and have no material examples and so on. And I'm going to give you another source here that you can use, that because these multiple credible sources are required for all of these sections. So you can use your textbook and you can use that source. And that's Misra, and that group of researchers, I think, explain it quite nicely, and you can pull through some of these points I've mentioned here in this section. Remember that in your rubric, though, they put limitations together here. So it's actually 5 marks for the ethical considerations, 5 for the limitations. So you shouldn't be going on and on about it. The next thing to talk about is your limitations. And apart from time and budget, which will be applicable for any type of research, there are some specific limitations that could apply to qualitative research specifically. And one of those is, of course, subjectivity and ensuring that your bias is not going to come in. So you would say that is a potential limitation of qualitative research, but that you're going to ensure that that is kept to the absolute minimum through, and then you can talk about some of those procedures that you use with your trustworthiness to ensure that that is overcome. As the rubric says, limitations and how you overcome them. Sometimes as well, when you're doing research like this and you've got quite a small sample size, it's not always that easy to replicate it, and maybe your findings are not quite as transferable as you would like them to be. data saturation just means that, again, it's a sample issue. So, if you said in your sample size you're going to interview 8 people, well, are you going to reach data saturation, which just means that after 8, have you really not found out anything new? Because you should only technically stop interviewing people when you're getting the same old things from all of them. If your sampling is too broad, that is also an issue, though, because that means you're never going to get consensus. You've got to find patterns in your data analysis, as you should have mentioned when you did your data analysis section in Project 3. But that is something, if it's been designed well and you've done a very small homogeneous study, that shouldn't really be an issue. Okay, so the limitations, I'm going to give you another source for that. It's another quite nice recent one. Just talks about some of these issues. Okay, as well as your textbook, you can always source your textbook for any of this theory as well, and you should do so. And just maintaining rigor, so that is another way that you can overcome any potential bias. So making sure that you are following a specific procedure. Just because it's qualitative doesn't mean that it's not a valid procedure to use. Okay, one limitation though that is not actually limitation is some sources you might try and look up, especially AI, will tell you that, oh, it's not generalizable, so that means it's a limitation. That is not a limitation, because it's a qualitative research and you never intended for it to be generalizable. That's why you're doing non-probability sampling. Okay, so let me just make sure you get that right. And then the last new section is going to be anticipated contribution of the study. So this must link back to your relevance section, to your lit review section, where you should have said what the gap was in the current research that yours is going to fill. And then hopefully that gave you a source that you could use, because you need to reference what you expect to achieve. So some source, some other researcher should have said, maybe in the end of their paper, oh, more research is needed into this. And you quote them to say that. And this is the gap you're going to fill. So align this back to what you said you were going to do. And remember that this is one single continuous proposal now. So this must link back to what your research problem is and what your relevance section says as well. All right, so if we have a look at what they're asking you to do here, this is 10 marks for this section here. So well substantiated, so you need multiple sources if you want to do well in this section. Okay, so it must be aligned with what you said you were going to research. And then just think about now, if you've just finished your Project 3 and you've done that questionnaire, you can imagine analyzing all that data. What do you think you're going to get from that in the end? And this deeper understanding that you've tried to get of the phenomenon that you originally talked about right in your research problem now, how's that going to add to the body of knowledge? How's it going to help the group of people that you're researching? There's got to be anticipated contribution in that respect as well. So that's the end of the new section. I'm just going to mention here, though, because I know I won't come back to it, is that don't forget the 10 marks for spelling and grammar. So do a proper check there at the end. But for now, we go back to part 1, Project 1. So you may have done very well in this, but you need to update it. Definitely need to update it. The first thing is that your research title. So when they say between 5 and 15, I cut that out because I thought, no, that's way too small. 15 words, looking at about that. You are researching one small, tiny little thing, and right up front, you should be showing how you zoned into that one little thing. So what is the topic that you're researching? And then, like you showed me at the beginning, you said, a lot of you said you were exploring something. So that verb at the beginning should strongly indicate that this is a qualitative study. And therefore, when you look right up at the title here, the title should be telling you exactly what you're researching. Okay, it needs to be obviously management related, and it should tell you the approach. So that's where the qualitative part comes in. Okay, so starting verb, like exploring this or that, or describing this. It should also say who you're researching, so the millennials, the SMEs, whoever it is, and where. So it's where's your target? You're targeting, I think I saw Durban earlier. So that's in the title, it's giving us that scope already. And if you are going to be marked on this, then I can see that the scope is explicit in the study because the who and the where is in the study. Appropriate for an undergraduate research study means it's a tiny, tiny little issue that you're looking at. Very small. You're only going to do, what, 8 to 10 limited interviews, just asking 5 to 10 questions. You really can't do and find out a lot with that. It must come right through from your title. Please just pop in the chat if you've got any questions or concerns about that. But, you know, apart from actually putting in the who and the, because now that you've done your population section, maybe you realize you had South Africa in your title and you think, oh, I'm going to make that smaller now. Apart from that, there shouldn't be too much to change. But your background certainly may change now. Because probably when you were doing this, maybe at that stage, you hadn't really thought about population too much. But you really had to nail it down in Project 3. So if you've now chosen millennials in Durban and your background makes no mention of that whatsoever, you're meant to be giving background as to what, who, and where you're researching before you introduce people to what the problem is. You need to give them all the context they could possibly need to understand the research problem. This is the link between your title and the problem itself. Okay, so that needs to be all in there, and it needs to have multiple sources. Every single section here, note, needs to have multiple sources. Right, it shouldn't need to be too long, like 2 paragraphs should be enough. And it should flow beautifully then into what your research problem is, which I actually wanted to do from here, because this is the crux. Look how big this section is. It's probably got the most requirements out of any section because it's so important. So there's no way that a research proposal gets done without this problem section being edited multiple times, because it all comes down to this. It's got to be succinct. That's the first thing. Concisely outlined. You should not be writing 3/4 of a page here. It should be one lengthy paragraph, maybe 2 paragraphs. You should be getting straight to the point here. It says here it must be concise. Otherwise, you're adding background, not the problem. Otherwise, you're adding collection methods and methodology and that sort of thing, not the problem. This must be to the point. So therefore, you can start with what the broad issue is. We already know from the background the who, where, and what. So now you can start being specific. It must, of course, link to what your title and background says. That's what the first point is there. And then what is the general problem and what is the very specific problem that you're trying to research? It might be an issue, it might be a problem. And having established that, why is this actually something that's worthwhile solving? Because just because it's a problem doesn't necessarily mean it's worth researching. And remember, a proposal is all about that. You've got to try and show that this should go ahead. And typically a research proposal gets taken on by an institution who says, yes, you are granted permission to do this study. And here is where you start setting that up, why it should be done. When it says here the criteria, if you have a look at your textbook as well, basically says that, is it feasible to do this research? So it's actually something that is researchable. Then it also says, what is the scope like? It can't be too narrow because then who cares? It also can't be too broad because then it's not possible again. And it's not really in a small undergrad study, and especially a qualitative study, that's probably the biggest point. Very small niche little phenomenon. Okay, so you shouldn't be doing the whole of purchase intention. You should be only looking at what purchase intention is in a specific niche market area or for a particular type of product, for example. So very, very small and needs to be relatable to a theoretical value and a couple of other points. But I think that's the most important thing. All right, and then you've got multiple credible sources that back up why this is actually a problem, why it needs to be solved. So double check that you've got proper credible sources, and that's not going to be your textbook. There should be no referencing of your textbook here because it's not about defining words or anything like that. It's who said that more research is needed on this? Who said that that was a problem in that area? Okay, so that's what we mean by multiple sources. Then there's got to be a clear problem and purpose statement. So the problem is, now you get to the specific problem. So you might have set the scene, added a bit of broad context for the problem, but then you need to get to the nitty-gritty. The problem is, and then the purpose of this research is to, there's your purpose statement. That is going to link straight through to your research question. Okay, so those statements need to be in there. And then the whole way that you've written this research problem must be written as a qualitative study. You're trying to get a deeper understanding. So this doesn't mean that you must go right there that this is an interpretive study, that this is a qualitative study, that you're going to collect data via interviews. It doesn't mean anything like that. Okay, so this is what the word alludes means here. It means that you can read between the lines that this is a qualitative study. You mustn't go and repeat everything that you've said in project 3. That's in the methodology section. So we must just understand by reading it, just like I looked at some of your titles and said, yeah, I can see that's a qualitative study. It's the way you write it that tells us all of those things. Should not be writing the data will be collected by this, or this is a qualitative study, or I'm going to be doing interviews, or I'm going to be doing content analysis. None of that is applicable here. It's just that you try and explain how you're trying to do something, that you're trying to understand this human issue or problem that is best addressed through a qualitative study. So the way you write the problem, the way you write your purpose statement is going to be key to getting that right. So quite a lot and quite tricky, and definitely something that I think from this first section that you should go and update and revise, because there's not one researcher I know who doesn't have to do that, and probably multiple times. Okay, then we come to the relevance section. So if we look at the relevance now, this is something that, having done project 2 and established that research gap, which you should have ended off the project 2 with, now you can come and say, this is why I need to do this research. It's going to add to the body of knowledge. Here is the academic relevance, and you're going to reference that. The rubric requires you to reference that. So that's something you need to look for, and you can probably do that now that you've done all of the project 2 as well. But in addition to that, who can practically use your results? Well, you've also just done that in project 3. You've said exactly who your target and accessible population is. Quite sure that they would be able to use these results and be relevant for them. And then, of course, it must be related to your field of study. So you must either explicitly, so you can actually mention it if you want, specifically what your area is, or it's just implied because you're doing something related to management. You might need to make that a bit more explicit, and that's why it's added as a separate point here in your rubric too. Okay, so justification is there. Concise again, concisely, don't overdo it. It's clearly in your field, so definitely management related at the very least. There's the practical value, so who can use your research results, your population, and other stakeholders potentially as well. You've got cited sources for your academic relevance. That's what I was trying to say there. That's the important one. And of course, your argument flows properly. But look here, if you have not referenced that academic significance, you're going to go into the fail category. So that, I think, is the biggest mistake that students make. Okay, and then it takes us on to the research question. Now, if you have done the research question, the research purpose in your purpose statement is in your problem, then that should flow quite nicely here. And your title, if that's been set up, just convert it into a question. You only need one single question. Your lecturer may have said that they want you to break it into sub-questions, so you can see what they've said about that. But most important is to get your overall research question right. And remember, you're a qualitative study, so you're going to find out what or how, not is. You shouldn't be using quantitative language. So you're trying to get that deeper understanding of something. So how does such and such work? What is such and such doing? Link it through. This must go back up top to the problem and the title, and then you should be able to follow this question all the way through to your final interview schedule, which would have been in your annexure that you just did in your last study. And the last part of part 1, your heading should be objectives, and this must relate straight back to your question. And whereas you only needed to have one research question, you need to have 2 to 3 objectives, and objectives then must together be able to answer your research question. So if you meet those 3 objectives, you should be able to answer the overall research question. Okay, so these are objectives. Whereas a question is written as a question with a question mark, how does something or other work? Now you have objectives, which is to explore, to describe. So write them as objectives, and then make sure that they're not going broader than your question. They must be focused, narrow, tight, very small, very manageable. Let's have a look. Yeah, just give you a sec to go check if you've got any questions on that. Then we are finished part 1. So note that it says here research question. So it might be just to check and see what your feedback was on this. I often think it's just asking for trouble by putting some questions in, because then there might be errors in it. If you've only got to have one and you've got your title and your purpose right, it's very easy to do well in this. Not as easy to do your objectives. Of course, you don't put the word hypothesis anywhere near it. So the correct heading is objectives. That's what that's saying. It's aligned to the research question. It's appropriately formulated. That means it starts with to describe or to explore. Sharp, clear, concise. So it's one sentence for each objective. You're not going to go and give long, boring explanations. You're not going to give AI written objectives that are convoluted and multi-part and far too fancy. Just a simple, straightforward one sentence that explains it. Must be very narrow in scope. Okay, so let's have a look at part 2 now. When you copy across, or if you haven't been using a single document, don't forget to amalgamate all of your references at this point. So there should be a lot of very good ones. And if you don't copy across the references for the articles that you use in the literature review, then you go into the failed category for it. It's worth 20 marks. So that is definitely a mistake that you must make now. Make sure that every single article that you did your literature review on is referenced properly in this proper place in the one single final references that you have. But this actually started with your theory, so you just needed one theory here. Don't think there's too much you needed to change there. Just look at the feedback that you got. It was quite simple, that you should have explained the theory. It must be an actual theory that comes from a textbook or something, not just more literature review. And you must say how it relates to your research. But you don't need to do anything too fancy there. It definitely says one theory only. You're also asking for trouble if you use more than that. Okay, this is something that's been refined over the years. It says theoretical approach and it says the theory. Okay, so one theory is explained. You've got to take it as an actual theory. You're not dealing with frameworks or anything like that. Simply saying that, look, here's somebody else that's looked broadly at this phenomenon. It's motivation, it's Herzog, it's resource theory. So particularly looking at this resource, and this is how it relates to my research. So you've explained it, you've applied it. If it's not an actual theory, it's going to go here, obviously. All right, I think that's nothing else too difficult about that, though. So let's have a look at the literature review itself. So perhaps this is the 3 most important sections here. If you have, first of all, identified that gap, you have a whole point of doing this is to see what other researchers have found and said about your topic. There's something that they haven't done, though. There's a gap in the literature. There's a gap in the research. You are going to partially fill that gap. That needs to be at the very end of your literature review. You can even put a heading and explain it there. Second thing is that you're not just giving summary, so you should never see a paragraph with just one source, and you should be integrating, synthesizing. This is what the one researcher found. This is compares in this way to what another researcher found. These 2 researchers agreed that the concept was described in this way. The findings of this study contradict the studies of that or agree with. So you are all the time integrating and synthesizing, and you are only researching what other people have found. You're not adding all your own commentary and thoughts and opinions about things. Minimum of 5 journal articles, try and make them a bit more recent than that, and preferably quite a few more articles than that. But however, it only says 5, so as long as you've ticked that box. Of course, it must be about what your research is. So check now your questionnaire or your interview schedule. You know what questions you've actually asked now. So not only do those need to relate to what your objectives are, of course, that needs to all tie in nicely, but also have your when you've done your literature review, have you reviewed those concepts? Maybe you are missing something. At the time, you may have done well in the lit review, but now that you've seen the big picture of what your research is about, did you leave out some sections here? You might need to go and update that. Okay, so then the other thing to look out for is each paragraph should have multiple different sources. That shows that you've integrated and synthesized, and there should also be no long sections without sources at all. If you can put some headings in to structure and order it, that helps the reader, but it also helps you to see if you're missing anything, because then you can go back and look at your research questions, you can look at your objectives, you can look at your interview questions, and you can see if everything ties in nicely together. Finally, you've got your conceptualization. This is definitely something that most likely you're going to have some more to add, or maybe you added some points here that are not actually relevant anymore, because again, go and look at what your interview schedule or your questionnaire said. Are they matching properly? Okay, so you've got to explain the concept. I know that quite a few lecturers like you to have 2 sources for every concept, but at the very least, according to the rubric, you have to have a minimum of 1 authoritative source, not just credible, authoritative. So probably one of your articles that you used in your literature review, or a textbook or something like that, not a website. So at least 1 good, preferably 2 per concept that you've explained, and then you link it to your research, or what do you mean by it? So when you ask that interview question that was trying to find out what their opinions were about micromanagement or whatever that you happen to be researching, then is that word in here? Is it explained? And is it explained as you were intending it to be? So I'm sure you're going to need to update this. If there's concepts in here now that weren't covered at all in your interview schedule or in your research problem or any other area, then maybe you need to ditch them at this point. I'm going to tighten this section up. All right, and that's basically the end of this section. Just to note that in the literature review, if you have not done that research gap, it's a fail too, so careful of that. And then I think the synthesis and so on. Yeah, worthwhile just checking that you've complied with everything. And yeah, you can see those authoritative sources, not just credible. Application to your research. That should not take you more than 3 sentences per concept though. So not long, big stories, not long, big paragraphs for each concept. Then that stuff probably belongs in the literature review itself, not under this section. All right, so then we come to part 3. So you've got your results for this. So hopefully you've got some feedback. It shouldn't need too much. So all I'm going to talk about here really is how you need to double check that this actually relates to the rest of your research, the whole proposal now. You will have feedback on the specifics, but of course your research paradigm should be interpretivism, and you should have explained and referenced what interpretivism means and linked that to your research. It definitely says in the rubric that for the paradigm, you must say why trying to get a deeper understanding of something is relevant for your research. What is it you're trying to get a deeper understanding of? So make sure you've applied the paradigm. Okay, that's very clearly needed from the rubric. Then, if you think about some of the other points you can talk about, what is it you're trying to understand, you're trying to explore, you're trying to describe. So watch the language that you use here. Don't try and make it sound quantitative or measurable in any way. And it's all about trying to understand and get an in-depth understanding of the small phenomenon that you're looking at. So you can think of the paradigm, if you look at the rubric, they combine it with design, but think of it more or less being half-half. And don't forget, explain, and the justification means the application. Apply it to your research. You had to do it interpretivistically because you were trying to get a deeper understanding or understand this human issue. Then it comes to design. So very succinctly, you can explain that your research is qualitative. Definitely, you need to define that and reference it and apply it. But then you can also mention most likely you're probably doing a cross-sectional interview because you're just doing it once off, one time. If you're not doing it cross-sectional, it just makes life more difficult for you in terms of your data collection and analysis sections. So cross-sectional, you're just doing an interview once off. That's it. And inductive, because that usually goes with a qualitative study. You are working from the specific to the general. And then in terms of the type of research, you can also define that you're doing a descriptive or exploratory research. Okay, so in that section, there you can see all of those three. Half of them are just on the paradigm. So those, I've covered all those already. And don't forget that part of the reason that you are doing qualitative is because your paradigm was interpretivism. That is your justification for doing a qualitative study, because you're an interpretivist. Right, then the population. So how did you do in the population? So where am I? Here we go. So the four main components there, according to the rubric. This should link back to what your title, what your background says. Who are you trying to research? So it was all SMEs in Durban. It was millennials in, let's say, the south coast of KZN, whatever it happens to be. That's who you ideally would have targeted. So it's all, starts with the word all. And then accessible is not those who happen to say yes to your interview. It's those that you have actually got access to. So a very small community, maybe even a smaller geographic area, but it's those who you practically have access to. Not, I don't know where I saw so much of this, not just because those who were willing to participate. Okay, that's not what we mean. Unit of analysis, probably company or individuals. And then if you can say how big the population was, so there's so many that fit into that criteria. And then, of course, your parameters that narrow down your population a bit more. More than welcome to ask any questions about that. If you've got any feedback that you're not sure of, I'll try and help. Okay, so you align from your target to your accessible, and then you narrow it down even more with your parameters. Be very specific there. So parameter is not males and females. It's not all ages. It would be people of a working age or retirees or something like that. All right, and then your sampling counts for 15 marks. So worthwhile putting a bit of effort into that. So the sampling, your first choice is you're going to say that it's non-probability sampling, and that's because your research is qualitative. So you make that link, you justify it because of that. And then you say what specific sampling type you're going to use. And you've got a number of choices. If you use your textbook, try and use one of those. So you're purposefully choosing those that match your population parameters. Maybe it's convenient sampling because of the nature of where you're doing your research. And maybe it's snowball sampling because you're finding out one person who matches your parameters and then you're snowballing, getting referrals from that. But you need to be practical and explain exactly the procedure you would follow so that you could give it to a friend and they could go and do your sampling for you. Small sample size, again, it's a qualitative study. You're trying to get an in-depth understanding. It's a case of maybe 10, whatever your motivation is for it. Name it, put a number in there or a range that you would go for, 8 to 10, 10 to 15, something like that, based on what your population is. All right, so just a bit more there about that. So it's non-probability, and you can choose one of those three is probably the most realistic to use. In that case, you would define what it means, motivate your reason for choosing that, and apply it and speak about who it is that you're researching. So don't just make it theoretical, explain, oh, well, this is because it's millennials. So you're going to purposefully choose millennials who are working in this area. So you don't just give a sort of superficial definition of what each of the things are. Okay, and as you can see there, quite a bit on sampling. You've examined all of those multiple different sources. You started off by saying it's non-probability. You've identified the method as, for example, convenience or purposive. You've given a very good reason for choosing that, and you've applied it. You've given a specific sample size or range and why you've chosen that, and then throughout you've used multiple sources. So hopefully not too difficult. Okay. This explain how the sampling would occur. Maybe you need to take the practical element and give it almost like a couple of steps that you would follow. That will help with that. All right, and then we've got the data collection. So I know they call it a questionnaire, but for your purposes, it's an interview schedule. You're still going to call it Annexure A or Annexure B if you've got your AI declaration in as Annexure A. Then this would be Annexure B. Just call it a questionnaire for the sake of it, but it could be a list of questions still. So it's an interview schedule, and then you would need to explain again all the practicalities of how you would go about it. Why is it an interview? What type of interview is it? What type of questions are you asking in it? And of course, then being able to give it to somebody so they could go and do the collection on your behalf because you've given them such detail, which for 20 marks means you really should be doing that. So one of the first things you're going to say is which type of interview. So it's a method of interview. So is it going to be face-to-face? Is it going to be a Teams meeting? Is it a phone? And you could do each of those, define it, reference it, justify it. It's semi-structured because you've got that questionnaire or that interview schedule. So you've got a list of questions that you're really going to ask. So you would define that and motivate it again. And at some point in this data collection section, you want to refer to this annexure and you want to explain that you have asked open-ended questions there, and that those questions are designed to draw out the information from your participants in order to meet your research objectives and your research question without repeating your questions, but you can still explain how you ask those questions and how this interview schedule has been set up to help you. That's just some of the things you can talk about. You can also talk about some of the practicalities. So how are you going to transcribe the data? How are you going to record them? How are you going to store them? Are you going to make some sort of notes on it? Are you going to just do audio? Are you going to do video as well? How are you going to get permission to do that? That informed consent that we talked about under ethics. You explain all of that here. Exactly how you would do it. Okay, there I was saying again, link to an Annexure A or wherever your interview questions happen to be. You can refer to it as that, but then your research instrument, perhaps is a better word for it, is an interview schedule. It's still a list of questions, however. So talking about that questionnaire then, it has still got an introduction. And in that introduction, you're going to introduce yourself. This is what you're researching. You're going to again explain that their participation is entirely voluntary and they can withdraw at any time, and exactly how long it would take or approximately, and thank them very much that they've got that informed consent, that of course their data and everything will be kept confidential. And then you come on to the actual questions themselves. So just recommended, have a look at your feedback. These are just some ideas. So a couple of questions asking them about their background and their history and their experience, because you need to have that information to almost profile them without giving away their identities. But it still does help when you actually, if you were to do the research and were to actually analyze it, to say, okay, well, that participant who had this kind of background, that may be why they suggested this or that answer or gave this kind of impression. And then you've set up your objectives, your 3 objectives probably. You pointedly only ask questions that are going to help you get the data to answer those objectives. Not other questions which might seem fantastic, that would be super interesting. You can't ask them, otherwise you must go and change your objectives. So very narrow, very focused, 10 in total, no more than that. Maybe one at the end that just sort of sums up and asks for recommendations or for anything else they'd like to ask. So that could be in there as well. And then, of course, a final thank you. Remember then that you talk about a funnel approach. That's why you start broad with that kind of background, and then you get very, very specific, that it's a maximum of 10 questions. And you'll see that there's some errors that are commonly made. The first one being that you can only ask open-ended questions. So go and look at your interview schedule. There should not be a single question starting with the word do, because then they can say yes or no. So it's got to be open-ended. It's got to be inviting to draw it out. You're trying to get a deeper understanding. So it should definitely be asking questions that solicit them to almost like draw the information, drag it out of them, and then you could ask a next question which follows up. They are semi-structured, and that means that on the day, if you were to do the research, you could ask follow-up things, but you still need to design these quite nicely. It's not this type of question. So if you've got closed-ended ones, you put a tick box, and they just have to tick something. Your research is not going to have any questions like that in it. Okay, none at all. So if you want to find out demographic information, you ask, please tell me a bit about your background in terms of your working profession or whatever it is that you want to ask. At the same time, then, you also got to watch out for this, that you don't ask two questions in one. That's a common error. One thing for one question. Can't be too leading, can't be too vague. And these are all just from your textbook anyway, so you can just double check that and just check the feedback that you got from your lecturer. However, the final submission needs to be checked against your objectives. So you might have done quite well in this in project 3, but that was not having to consider project 3 if this is actually going to do what it's intended to do. Is this going to get what you needed for your research problem and to meet your objectives? So you need to check that that still aligns. All right, and then you've got your data analysis. Remember that this should all be future tense, because this is just how you would analyze the data were you to do the interviews. So you shouldn't be saying that data was collected and then I did this and then I did the coding, because you haven't. That's just not true. So it should all be future tense. This is how you propose to analyze the data. So the intention here is to say what method you used and why. And probably many of you will be using content analysis. That's the one that's in your textbook for interviews. Otherwise, if you use thematic analysis, then you need to make sure you've got the right sources for that and you've explained it properly. You don't confuse the two. And the coding method that you would use, because ultimately you've recorded those interviews. You've now got a transcript of your whole conversation, and now you need to try and break it down and find that the themes that they're trying to say, and then you're looking across all of your interview transcripts and you've got to try and see what are the common patterns that are coming out there, and that's how you get to your final solution. And of course you need to explain the steps in that. You should have applied the steps, motivated why this was the best reason for you doing it. Okay, so those are probably the two methods that you're going to use. And then watch as well that you just keep it simple. It's a very small study. You wouldn't be doing too many of them. So manual coding is absolutely fine. You wouldn't be going and saying you're using in vivo unless you're paying for that, unless you know what that actually is. And you certainly wouldn't be saying you're going to use a tool such as in vivo or such as, and name a couple, because you should be saying exactly what you're doing here. So you need to pick one and stick with it and motivate why you're using it. Otherwise, it's just clear that you just read it somewhere or AI gave you the answer, but you don't actually know what you're talking about. So be very careful on that. All right, so here are some of the steps then, and you'll see this from your textbook. So you just reference your textbook in terms of this, how you would do if you chose content analysis. So you get those transcripts from the data collection step. You define what your coding unit is, and you assign it a code. You're perhaps going to test that code as well, just check that it worked right on one of the transcripts, and you start trying to annotate now on the transcripts and pick up words that have meaning to you, that you can say, oh yeah, I think that's what they meant by this. And then you start grouping words together. Okay, and from that, you can start choosing what appears to be common patterns. And if you had done your sampling very well, then hopefully you start seeing those clear patterns. When you've got very specific objectives, you can also start narrowing it down a bit. And from this, you end up with the final report. Okay, so that's quite theoretical, but you can definitely explain it. If I could just mention, sorry, where is it? Over here. Yes. Okay, so the coding method that you use. So choose one, and it's in your Research Matters textbook as well, in the qualitative data analysis chapter. Name it, explain it, reference it, and that is one way of making it a bit more personal to you, because otherwise I know it is quite theoretical, this section. But let's just see those two sections together then. So data collection, that's what we mentioned, it was 20 marks. So if you cover everything I've done now and take your feedback on board, then hopefully that gives you everything you need to get to the 20 marks. Okay, your questionnaire. Sure, you check your feedback from that as well. And then, of course, data analysis, another 15 marks. So this last little bit here, if you think about the questionnaire, your data analysis and your data collection is going to give you 45 marks. So there's a lot to do there. So don't lose momentum, but don't sort of leave this till the last minute. Perhaps you need to fix project 3 feedback first. And that's basically the end of the qualitative procedure, because then we just go back to section 4, which I started this session with, which was your the trustworthiness and so on. So just overall, remember the tenses, like you're putting it all together, it's got to make sense. So the literature review, you were researching what other people have done. So it's past tense. They found this. They suggested that. So it's all past tense. The data collection this is how you would collect the data. This is how you would analyze the data in the data analysis section. So there you're using future tense. So try and get somebody to read over the whole thing for you and see if it makes sense from a grammatical perspective. And at the same time, they can see if you haven't wandered off, started talking about something else, and check the cohesion for you. Also check that your style has stayed the same, that it's authentically you. There's not AI slipping in here and there. And then check that when you are referencing, that is also consistent throughout. Because suddenly now in a 200-mark project, you accumulate errors. You've also had to copy and paste, and things can go wrong there. Don't waste 5 or 10%, which is out of a 200-mark project, 10 or 20 marks. Think how hard you worked for 20 marks to do each of these sections. The whole lit review was worth that. Now you throw it away over referencing. So don't run out of time on that. They accumulate very fast. Look how short some of these projects were. And 1 or 2 mistakes wouldn't have given you a 5%, but you put them all together now, suddenly you've got 5, and these are 5% off. So be very, very careful on that, please. Also check your referencing now overall, like have you got up-to-date sources throughout? Could you make some of them more credible? Are there a couple of websites that have slipped in here and there, which maybe you've got some stats for the background, and that's fair enough. But when you look at your overall final references combined from all 4 projects, is it all perfectly in alphabetical order with a variety of different sources there, multiple credible sources for every section? This is something I would go through and read your document purely looking at referencing. Maybe you swap with a friend who's doing this module as well. So let's just check each other's references and look at nothing else but that. Okay, it's worth doing. Then you want to maybe give it to somebody you know who's just pretty good at proofreading and let them go and check the proofreading. Don't let AI rewrite your work. Shorten it. Make it fancier because it just becomes boring and not yours anymore. We would rather have some oddly worded sentences and phrases and so on that's you, as long as you've done like basic spelling checks and put your punctuation marks in and so on, then I think that's what's important. Okay, so any use of AI whatsoever, just rather be precautious, even if you just used it once for one tiny section, just by default put it in. Even if you just had to use it for brainstorming. I mean, I can't see anybody who wouldn't use AI in some form or other. Just don't copy and paste from the AI, that's all. Okay, but otherwise, put it in properly. You're not going to say OpenAI was a source and reference it like that. You might think that that's the right thing to do, which while technically it's fine, it's not a credible source. So it's just going to mark you down on that aspect, which is going to kill you in all of the rubrics. So don't do that. Do this. Annexure A, AI declaration, follow the normal procedures, which includes all of the stuff here I've got on the left. And then you're covered. I mean, you're not going to get into any harm if that happens. Maybe the person who you asked to proofread, you just say, oh, which in here like sounds suspiciously like AI now. I'm going to go put it in my own voice. Okay, just do that. All right, so these are those final tips. I did mention this right at the beginning, so I'm not going to cover them again. I'm going to take you right through to the final thing, which is don't forget that word count overall. Write it on the cover. Don't go over it, because I would hate not to be able to mark your final section because you're over the word count. And finally, best of luck. 2 weeks time, it'll all be over. And yes, sure, I will post it on, you have to just ask your lecturer, I think, because it will be there. Thank you so much. I feel like I talked a lot, but I had a lot to get through. It will be posted on our the lecturers Teams group. I'll put the PDF there and the recording, so you can just ask your lecturer to give it to you. All right, but best of luck, and just think it'll all be over in 2 weeks. So that's going to be a huge cause for celebration. You should all be very proud of yourselves as to where you've got to now, and think about where you started, and you are so much more knowledgeable on such a difficult module. So well done. Good luck for all of your assessments, and especially this one. And when it's all over, have a fantastic celebration, a lovely relax, and all the very, very best. Okay, we'll be thinking of you, because it's certainly a lot to get through, I know. All right, so stay on if you've got any other questions. Otherwise, again, thank you so much. Much appreciated.